There are moments in life when it feels like everything is falling apart, when prayers go unanswered, when hope feels distant, and when doubt creeps in quietly, whispering, "What if God's promises aren't real?" It's easy to trust when life is smooth, when everything aligns with our plans. But what about the moments when it doesn't? What about the heartbreak, the silence, the waiting? That's when faith meets its truest test. Here's the truth you need to hold on to. God's promises are always true, whether you feel it or not. His faithfulness isn't based on your emotions or circumstances. It's anchored in who He is, and He does not change. Your feelings will shift. Life will throw unexpected storms, but His promises remain steady, like an anchor holding firm beneath the waves. Think about the sun. Even on the cloudiest day, when the sky is gray and heavy, the sun hasn't disappeared. It's still there, shining just as brightly. You just can't see it right now. God's promises are like that. They're constant, unchanging, even when life's circumstances cloud your view. You might feel forgotten, but His promise says, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." You might feel unloved, but His word declares, "Nothing can separate you from my love." You might feel overwhelmed, but He whispers, "My grace is sufficient for you." When life doesn't make sense, when you're drowning in questions, when your heart feels heavy, remember His promises. Not because you feel strong, but because His words are stronger than your feelings. His promises aren't fragile. They don't break under the weight of your doubt. They stand firm because they are rooted in His character, not your circumstances. So even if today feels heavy, even if hope feels distant, hold on. God's promises are still true. Always have been. Always will be. Not just for others, but for you. Even here, even now. Sometimes it's hard to believe in God's promises when life feels like it's falling apart. The waiting gets long, the silence feels deafening, and you start to wonder, did God forget about me? But here's the truth. God's silence is never a sign of His absence. Just because you don't see Him working doesn't mean He's not. His promises are still true, even in the waiting. Waiting can feel like the hardest part of faith. It tests your patience, your hope, and sometimes even your identity. But the waiting isn't wasted. God does some of His deepest work in the seasons when it feels like nothing is happening. Think about seeds planted in the ground. There's a period where nothing seems to change, where everything looks still. But beneath the surface, growth is happening. Roots are spreading, foundations are being built, all hidden from view. That's what's happening in your life, even if you can't see it right now. God's promises aren't based on your timeline. They're based on His perfect timing. And His timing is never late. Sometimes the delay isn't a denial. It's preparation. It's protection. It's God making sure that when His promise arrives, you're ready to receive it fully. You may feel tired. You may feel like giving up. But don't. Hold on to what you know, even when your heart is overwhelmed by what you don't understand. God's promises were never about your ability to hold everything together. They're about His ability to hold you, even when you feel like you're falling apart. When doubt creeps in, when fear feels louder than faith, remind yourself, God's promises are true, not because I feel it today, but because He's proven it time and time again. Look back at your life. Remember the times you thought you wouldn't make it, but you did. Not because everything was perfect, but because God was faithful. And if He was faithful then, He'll be faithful now. So, even in the waiting, even in the wondering, even in the silence, hold on. His promises are true, always. There will be days when doubt feels louder than faith, when your heart is weary, and you wonder if God's promises still stand. But here's the unshakable truth. God's promises are not fragile. They are not dependent on your circumstances, your feelings, or your ability to believe perfectly. They are rooted in His character, and His character never changes. God is not a man that He should lie. His words are not empty. They are alive, active, and filled with power. When He makes a promise, it's not just hopeful words. It's a guarantee backed by the one who created the universe. Think about that for a moment. The same God who spoke the stars into existence has spoken promises over your life. But sometimes, the hardest part isn't believing God can do it. It's believing He will do it for you. It's easy to believe for others, to see His faithfulness in someone else's story. But when it comes to your own life, the doubts creep in. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I've messed up too much. Maybe God's promises aren't for me. But none of that is true. God's promises are not based on your performance. They're based on His faithfulness. You can't earn them, and you can't disqualify yourself from them. His love isn't conditional, and His promises aren't either. They stand firm, not because you're holding tightly to Him, but because He is holding tightly to you. Think of the waves in the ocean. No matter how many times they crash against the shoreline remains. God's promises are like that shore, unchanging, steadfast, even when the waves of life feel overwhelming. Your doubts, your fears, your questions, they may come and go like the tide. But His promises, they remain. So when life feels uncertain, when your faith feels fragile, anchor yourself to this. God's promises are true, not just for others, not just in the past, but for you, right here, right now. Even in your doubt, even in your struggle, even in your waiting. His promises are true because He is true, and that will never change. Sometimes, holding on to God's promises feels like holding on to a thin thread, fragile, delicate, and easy to lose. But here's the beautiful truth. God's promises aren't fragile, even if your faith feels like it is. His promises don't depend on the strength of your grip. They depend on the strength of His word, and His word has never failed. You see, God's promises are not based on how you feel in the moment. They stand firm through every storm, every doubt, every season of uncertainty. When life feels unfair, when prayers seem unanswered, and when hope feels distant, it's not because God's promises have changed. It's because life is hard, and sometimes our hearts struggle to see the bigger picture. But God's faithfulness isn't tied to your circumstances. He's faithful in the silence. He's faithful in the waiting. He's faithful even when you feel forgotten. Because His promises were spoken over your life long before you face the battles you're in now. They were written with eternity in mind, not just the momentary struggles we face today. Think about a mountain. From the bottom, it's hard to see the view from the top. The climb feels endless, the path steep and overwhelming. But just because you can't see the summit, doesn't mean it's not there. The mountain hasn't moved. It's your perspective that's limited. The same is true with God's promises. Just because you can't see the fulfillment yet doesn't mean it's not real. His promises are there, standing firm, waiting for the right moment to unfold in your life. And here's the thing. God is not slow in keeping His promises. His timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match ours. What feels like a delay to us is often God's way of preparing us, shaping us, and positioning us to receive what He has in store. Because His promises aren't just about giving us what we want. They're about giving us what we need, at the right time, in the right way. So if you're in a season of waiting, If you're wondering if God has forgotten his promises, hold on. Not because you have to be strong enough, but because he is strong enough. His promises are as true today as they were the day he spoke them over your life. And they will come to pass, not because of who you are, but because of who he is. Faithful, unchanging, true, always. There's something powerful about realizing that God's promises aren't just words on a page. They're living truths, woven into the very fabric of your life. They aren't distant or abstract. They are personal, specific, and unchanging. Even when your world feels unstable, his promises stand like an anchor, holding you steady in the storm. But let's be honest, there are moments when doubt creeps in, when the waiting feels too long, when the silence feels too loud. You start to wonder, did I hear God wrong? Or maybe his promises aren't for me. But here's what you need to remember. God's promises are not fragile. They are not dependent on your feelings, your circumstances, or even your faith. They are rooted in his character, and his character never changes. Think about the sunrise. Whether you see it or not, whether it's cloudy or clear, the sun rises every single day. It doesn't depend on your ability to witness it. It simply is. God's promises are like that. Whether you feel them or not, whether you see the evidence or not, they remain true. His faithfulness doesn't waver when your faith feels weak. His promises don't disappear just because you're struggling to believe. God is not a man that he should lie. His words are eternal, spoken with the authority of the one who created the universe. When he says, "I will never leave you," he means it. When he says, "I have plans to prosper you, not to harm you," he's already working them out, even when you can't see it. His promises are not temporary comforts. They are eternal truths. And here's the beautiful thing. God's promises don't rely on your perfection. They aren't rewards for getting everything right. They are gifts, rooted in his grace and love for you. You can't earn them, and you can't lose them. They are yours because he is faithful, not because you are flawless. So when you're in the waiting, when your heart feels heavy, when the doubts feel louder than your faith, hold on. Not because you're strong, but because he is. His promises are true, not just in the light, but in the dark. Not just on the mountaintop, but in the valley. Not just when you feel them, but even when you don't. His promises are true, always, forever, for you. At the end of the day, when the noise quiets and the doubts creep in, it's easy to wonder if God's promises still stand. But here's the truth that remains unshaken. God's promises are not dependent on your circumstances, your emotions, or your current situation. They are rooted in his unchanging nature. And that's what makes them true. Always. You may feel like you're in the middle of a storm, waves crashing around you, wondering if you'll ever find peace again. But God never promised a life without storms. He promised to be with you through them. He promised that when the waters rise, you won't be overtaken. When the fires burn, you won't be consumed. His promises are not about avoiding the hard times. They're about his presence in the midst of them. Faith isn't the absence of fear or doubt. It's choosing to believe even when it's hard. It's standing in the middle of uncertainty and declaring, "I don't understand, but I trust you." Because God's promises aren't fragile. They don't crumble under the weight of your questions or disappear when life gets tough. They stand firm, like an anchor, holding you steady when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Think of the stars. Even when the sun is shining and you can't see them, you know they're still there. Hidden, but present. God's promises are like that. Just because you can't see them in this moment doesn't mean they're not real. They are constant, shining in the background of your life, waiting for the right moment to break through the darkness. And when you feel weak, when you feel like your faith isn't enough, remember this. God's promises don't rely on the strength of your faith. They rely on the strength of His faithfulness. Even when you can't hold on, He's holding you. Even when you let go, He doesn't. So today, if you're feeling lost, overwhelmed, or unsure, take a deep breath. Rest in the truth that God's promises are not just for someone else. They're for you. They are true in the waiting, true in the silence, true in the heartbreak, and true in the victory. They are true yesterday, today, and forever. Not because you believe perfectly, but because He is perfectly faithful. And that will never change.